In 1669, a man in Hamburg, Germany boiled down over 1,000 gallons of human urine because he believed he could extract gold from it. He heated the putrid black sludge with sand and charcoal inside a sealed glass vessel until his furnace glowed red, and he waited. Hours passed. Then something dripped from the bottom of the apparatus that made him forget about gold entirely. It was a pale, waxy substance that glowed by itself in the dark. No flame, no heat source. Just a soft, eerie green light radiating off a lump of wax sitting on his workbench. He called it cold fire. Within 2 centuries, a version of that substance would end up in the pocket of nearly every person in the industrialized world, because it was the key ingredient that made the modern match possible. And, within a few decades after that, it would be eating through the jawbones of the women and children who manufactured those matches, disfiguring them so severely that their neighbors compared them to lepers. What nobody understood in that Hamburg cellar was that this cold fire would become one of the most contradictory substances in the history of chemistry. A material found in every living cell on Earth, essential to human bone and DNA, and at the same time, one of the most horrifying industrial poisons the modern world would ever encounter. The man behind the urine experiment was Hennig Brand. He was not a trained scientist. He was a former soldier who had served in the final stretch of the 30 Years' War. And after leaving the army, he married a woman whose dowry was large enough to fund his real passion, which was alchemy. Brand believed, as alchemists had for centuries, that the philosopher's stone could transform base metals into gold. And he had a theory about where to find it. Urine was golden in color. It came from the human body, which alchemists considered a work of biological perfection. To Brand, this logic was airtight. Gold was hiding in plain sight, flowing unnoticed and free out of every person in the city. He collected barrels of urine, probably from the local military barracks. He let it sit for days until it gave off a smell so foul that worms started forming in it. Then, he boiled it down to a thick, tarry residue, mixed the residue with sand and charcoal, and loaded the mixture into a glass vessel called a retort. He sealed it and cranked the heat as high as his furnace could go. After many hours, glowing fumes filled the vessel. A liquid dripped out, burst briefly into flame, and then solidified into a waxy white substance that continued to glow in the dark for hours. This was phosphorus. Brand had just become the first named person in recorded history to discover a chemical element, and he had done it by accident while trying to do something completely impossible. He did not understand what he had found. He tried to use it to make gold. That did not work, but Brand immediately recognized that this glowing substance was unlike anything the world had seen before. Existing luminescent materials, like the Bologna stone that Italian shoemakers had discovered decades earlier, needed to be charged by sunlight and faded quickly. Brand's substance did not fade. It seemed to glow with what people described as a life force, a light that came from within and did not depend on any outside source. The name he eventually chose reflected exactly that. He called it Phosphorus, from the Greek word phosphoros, meaning bringer of light. Brand kept his method secret for years, as alchemists always did, but he had a large family to support, and his wife's money was running out. Eventually, he was paid to share the recipe. A merchant named Johann Daniel Kraft bought the secret first, then the mathematician and philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. Kraft traveled European courts, demonstrating the substance to fascinated royals. Leibniz thought phosphorus might actually be the philosopher's stone. It was not. But in the process, the secret escaped into the wider scientific world, and phosphorus moved from one man's cellar into the hands of some of the most prominent chemists in Europe. By the early 1700s, the Anglo-Irish chemist Robert Boyle and his assistant Ambrose Godfrey had independently figured out how to produce phosphorus and had begun refining the process. Boyle published details of his experiments, and phosphorus became a sensation in scientific circles across Europe. People were captivated by the ghostly glow, by the way the waxy material would spontaneously burst into flame when exposed to open air. A German professor of medicine named Johann Thomas Hensing even demonstrated that phosphorus was present in the human brain, which led to one of the worst medical ideas of the era: Because phosphorus was found in the brain, physicians reasoned it must be good for you. They started prescribing it as medicine. Patients were given doses of elemental white phosphorus to treat everything from fatigue to tuberculosis. The reasoning was catastrophically wrong. White phosphorus is lethally toxic. A dose of roughly 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight is enough to kill an adult. People who took these remedies sometimes died from the treatment that was supposed to save them. But the property of white phosphorus that would matter most to history had nothing to do with medicine or alchemy. White phosphorus ignites at an extraordinarily low temperature, around 30 degrees Celsius. That is roughly 86 degrees Fahrenheit, barely above room temperature on a warm summer day. And when it meets oxygen, it reacts violently. These two facts made white phosphorus uniquely dangerous to handle. They also made it uniquely suited to solve a problem that had frustrated humanity for thousands of years: the problem of making fire on demand. Before the 1820s, starting a fire was work. Serious work. You struck a piece of flint against steel and nursed the resulting sparks into a pile of tinder, blowing gently and praying the tinder would catch. You used a tinderbox, which could take several frustrating minutes, especially if the tinder was damp. You carried a smoldering slow match or borrowed a flame from a neighbor's hearth. If your fire went out at night in the winter, relighting it in the morning could be a genuine ordeal. There were some experimental solutions. In 1780, someone invented the phosphorus taper, a stick tipped with phosphorus sealed inside a glass tube. You snapped the tube open, and the phosphorus caught fire on contact with air. It worked, but it was expensive, fragile, and terrifying. A phosphorus box was introduced in Paris in 1789, but it was just as hazardous. Through the late 1700s and into the early 1800s, chemists tried again and again to use sulfur and phosphorus to create a reliable, portable fire starter. All of them failed to produce anything practical enough for everyday use. The idea of instant, on-demand fire had been a dream for centuries. Nobody had cracked it. In 1827, a pharmacist in the English town of Stockton-on-Tees named John Walker stumbled onto the solution almost by accident. He had been experimenting with chemical pastes for use in firearms. While scraping a wooden mixing stick coated in his experimental paste against the stone floor of his shop, the stick caught fire. Walker was startled, but he recognized what he had. He refined the formula using a mixture of antimony sulfide, potassium chlorate, gum arabic, and sulfur, and he dipped thin sticks into it. He started selling these friction lights to local customers in the spring of 1827. His sales ledger recorded the items as sulfurata hyperoxygenata frict. Not exactly a catchy brand name. Walker's matches worked, but they were far from perfect. They stank of sulfur, badly enough to clear a room. They struck inconsistently, sometimes requiring several attempts before they would light. And sometimes the burning head would detach from the stick entirely and drop onto the floor, scorching carpets, shoes, and clothing. Walker was advised to patent the idea, but he refused. He reportedly said that he doubted it not to be a benefit to the public, and so he let them have it for free. Within 2 years, a chemist in London named Samuel Jones had copied the concept, improved the formula slightly, and started selling his own version under the memorable name Lucifers. The term caught on. For decades, the word Lucifer was slang for a match across much of Europe. The matches sold well enough, but they were still too rough and unreliable to truly change daily life. That changed in 1831, when a 19-year-old French chemistry student named Charles Saurier took Walker's formula and replaced the antimony sulfide with white phosphorus. Saurier was studying at the Collège de l'Arc in the small town of Dole in eastern France. His professor had demonstrated a violent reaction by striking a mixture of potassium chlorate and sulfur with a hammer, and the young student became fascinated with the possibility of controlling that reaction. He ran experiment after experiment in his tiny dormitory room, which his biographer later described as a volcano in miniature. When he finally added white phosphorus to the mixture and bound it with gum arabic, The result was a match that could be struck on any rough surface with almost no effort. A strike anywhere match. Cheap, reliable, instant fire. Sauer never made any money from his invention. He was poor and he had no way to patent it. His professor shared the formula with a German manufacturer named Friedrich Kammerer, who secured the patent and set up mass production. The white phosphorus match spread across Europe and then the rest of the world at a speed that is hard to overstate. The first match factory using white phosphorus opened in Stockholm in 1836. By the middle of the century, match factories were running in England, France, Germany, the United States, and dozens of other countries. By the time Charles Sauer died in August of 1895, global production had reached roughly 3 trillion matches per year. Fire had gone from a skill you had to learn, a resource you had to manage and physically carry, to a disposable commodity sitting in a small box in your coat pocket. You could light a candle, a stove, a pipe, or a lantern in a single second with the flick of your wrist. White phosphorus matches reshaped daily routines, extended productive hours after dark, and were directly responsible for a massive surge in tobacco smoking during the second half of the 19th century. A box of matches cost almost nothing. For the first time in human history, fire was truly portable and truly instant. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. The very property that made white phosphorus perfect for matches, that absurdly low ignition point, and that violent reaction with oxygen, also made it lethal for the people who handled it every day. The workers inside match factories were overwhelmingly women and girls. Some were as young as 15. They worked 12 to 14-hour shifts in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms. Their job was to dip thin wooden splints into heated vats of white phosphorus paste, handle the freshly dipped matches before they dried, and pack them into boxes. They inhaled phosphorus fumes constantly. They got the paste on their hands and faces. They ate their meals in the same rooms where the paste was being heated, because there was no separate area for eating. The first medical reports of what came to be called phossy jaw appeared in the 1840s. Its formal name was phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. The condition began with persistent toothaches and a dull redness in the gums. Then, the gums started to swell and ulcerate. Beneath the surface, the jawbone itself was dying. Abscesses formed, and the bone slowly rotted inside the patient's face. In severe cases, the infected gums would glow a faint greenish white in the dark, a sickening mirror of the cold fire that Hennig Brand had marveled at almost 2 centuries earlier. Treatment, when it existed at all, meant surgical removal of the dead bone. Sometimes the entire lower jaw had to be taken out. Sometimes the infection spread to the brain and the patient died. In 1857, a surgeon in New York named James Rushmore Wood published a medical case study with the title Removal of the Entire Lower Jaw. His patient was a 16-year-old girl named Cornelia who had worked 8 hours a day in the packing department of a match factory for 2.5 years. That was all it took. The phosphorus had destroyed her jaw. Wood removed the entire bone. He included illustrations of the results in his published paper. Cornelia was 16. She had been packing matchboxes, not even dipping the sticks directly, and the ambient fumes in the factory had been enough. In England, the novelist Charles Dickens wrote about the disease in his journal Household Words as early as 1852, bringing the horror to a wider audience. Medical records from Zurich, covering the period from 1867 to 1889, told a grim statistical story. Symptoms typically appeared about 5 years after a worker started handling white phosphorus. The lower jaw was affected in about 75% of cases. The average age of the patients was 30. The vast majority were women. Historical accounts often compared phossy jaw sufferers to people with leprosy because the disfigurement was so visible and the social stigma so severe. Workers who developed the condition were fired. No other match factory would hire them because having a phossy jaw case on the payroll would draw unwanted attention to working conditions. These women lost their jaws and then lost any ability to earn a living. And, the factories already knew, the safe alternative had been available for years. In 1845, the Austrian chemist Anton von Schrotter discovered red phosphorus, a different structural form of the exact same element. Red phosphorus is non-toxic. It does not ignite spontaneously. It cannot cause phossy jaw. A Swedish chemist named Gustav Erik Pasch had already designed a safety match that separated the combustible ingredients between the match head and a specially prepared striking surface with red phosphorus coated on the strip on the side of the box. The Lundström brothers, Johan Edvard and Carl Franz, improved the design in Sweden and began manufacturing safety matches in the city of Jönköping. Their matches won a silver medal at the Paris World Fair of 1855, specifically because they could be produced without poisoning the workers who made them. The fix was right there, proven, available. Cheaper to produce than people assumed. But British and American factories kept using white phosphorus anyway. The economics was simple. White phosphorus matches cost less. They struck anywhere, which consumers preferred. And factory owners were terrified that switching would hand their export markets to competitors who had not made the change. A report to the British Parliament in 1899 stated that 36 workers had contracted phossy jaw between 1894 and 1897, out of just over 3,000 people employed handling phosphorus. The government documented the damage and then decided that the match trade was worth more than the workers' faces. The turning point came from the factory floor, not from Parliament. In July of 1888, roughly 1,400 women and girls walked off the job at the Bryant and May match factory in the East End of London. The walkout was sparked when management tried to force workers to sign a statement contradicting a newspaper article about conditions in the factory. That article, written by social activist Annie Besant and published in her weekly paper called The Link, had described the brutal reality of match work, the low wages, the punishing fines, the 14-hour days, and the rotting jaws. When Bryant and May fired a worker in retaliation, the entire factory floor walked out. The Match Girls, as the press quickly named them, became a national sensation. Before the strike, match workers were considered part of the lowest class of society. During the strike, they met members of Parliament. The Times wrote editorials about them. The public, which had been happily striking its matches without a thought for the people who made them, was suddenly confronted with the faces and the missing jaws behind the product. After 3 weeks, the Match Girls won. Bryant and May agreed to abolish all fines and deductions and promised no retaliation against strikers. The Match Girls went on to form the largest union of women workers in the entire country. The strike did not immediately end the use of white phosphorus, but it did something that mattered just as much. It dragged the suffering of match workers into public view in a way that could not be pushed back into the dark. William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, opened a match factory of his own in 1891 that used only red phosphorus. He sold boxes of safe matches branded as lights in darkest England and pressured retailers across the country to stop stocking white phosphorus matches entirely. Countries started banning white phosphorus in matches one by one. Finland, then part of Russia, led the way in 1872. Denmark followed in 1874. France in 1897. Each ban proved that the match industry could survive without the poison. Then, in September of 1906, 7 nations signed the Berne Convention, a treaty explicitly banning the manufacture, import, and sale of matches containing white or yellow phosphorus. The full title of the treaty was the International Convention Respecting the Prohibition of the Use of White Phosphorus in the Manufacture of Matches. It was concluded on September 26, 1906, and it entered into force on January 1, 1912. Eventually, 48 countries signed on. Britain, despite being one of the world's largest match producers, passed its own domestic ban in 1908, effective January 1, 1910. The United States was one of the last major nations to act, and for a strange reason, the Diamond Match Company held the patent for the safer phosphorus sesquisulfide formula. As long as they held that patent, every other American match manufacturer was effectively locked into using the old white phosphorus process. Phossy jaw persisted in the United States longer than in almost any other industrialized nation. In 1910, at the personal urging of President William Howard Taft, the Diamond Match Company voluntarily surrendered its patent and placed the safer formula into the public domain. In 1912, Congress passed the White Phosphorus Match Act, which placed a prohibitive tax on any match made with white phosphorus, making them commercially dead. The poisonous match era was over. But white phosphorus itself found a new career. Even as governments were banning it from matchboxes, armies were loading it into artillery shells. The British military introduced white phosphorus as a battlefield weapon late in 1916 during World War I. They used it in grenades and mortar rounds to create thick smoke screens that concealed troop movements across open ground. The same chemical behavior that made it catch fire so easily, that violent reaction with air, made it devastatingly effective as a weapon. White phosphorus burns at extreme temperatures. It sticks to skin, to clothing, to anything it touches. And it is nearly impossible to extinguish because the combustion reaction feeds itself as long as oxygen is available. During World War II, white phosphorus was used by both Allied and Axis forces across every major theater of the war, from the Pacific Islands to the hedgerows of Normandy. American and British forces used it for screening, for illumination, for marking targets from the air, and as an incendiary against fortified enemy positions. Bomber formations used white phosphorus rounds dropped by the lead aircraft to mark targets for the planes behind them. Ground forces loaded it into mortar shells, artillery rounds, and hand grenades. The British developed a specific incendiary grenade, the No. 76 Special, that used white phosphorus as the primary ignition agent, combined with benzene. The tactic American forces developed became known by a blunt name: shake and bake. They fired white phosphorus rounds at entrenched enemy positions to force the fighters out into the open, then immediately followed with high explosive rounds to hit them as they fled. A 1943 military test found that white phosphorus smoke screens fired at simulated German defensive positions killed or seriously wounded roughly 40% of the defenders before American infantry even arrived. That result was not lost on the commanders reading the report. Soldiers gave white phosphorus a nickname that stuck. They called it Willy Pete, derived from the military phonetic alphabet letters for W and P. The name followed the substance through every conflict of the 20th and 21st centuries, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq and beyond. The legal status of white phosphorus in warfare has never been cleanly resolved, and that ambiguity is not accidental. The 1906 Berne Convention banned it from matches, not from weapons. The Chemical Weapons Convention does not classify white phosphorus as a chemical weapon because its primary military role is incendiary and smoke-producing, even though the substance is, by any medical definition, acutely toxic. Protocol 3 of the 1980 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons restricts the use of incendiary weapons near civilian areas, but it specifically exempts munitions whose incendiary effects are considered secondary to their smoke-producing function. White phosphorus sits squarely inside that exemption. Military officials in multiple countries have classified their white phosphorus rounds as smoke munitions rather than incendiary munitions, even when those same rounds were being used to set fire to enemy positions. The result is a substance that falls through every legal gap the international community has tried to build around it. It is not classified as a chemical weapon. It is not fully regulated as an incendiary weapon. It remains in the arsenals of every major military on Earth. Technically legal, perpetually controversial, and still burning. The substance that Hennig Brand pulled from a barrel of rotting urine in 1669 while searching for gold went on to touch every major transformation of the modern world. It rewrote what scientists understood about the nature of elements. It gave ordinary people the ability to carry fire in their pockets for the first time in history. It created a global consumer industry and then destroyed the bodies of the workers who built it. It sparked one of the earliest international labor treaties and one of the first great strikes led by women. And it became a weapon that soldiers still deploy on battlefields more than 350 years after its discovery. The match you strike today does not contain white phosphorus. It has not contained white phosphorus for over a century. The red tip on the match head and the brown strip on the side of the box are the direct legacy of every person who fought to replace the old formula. Chemists like Anton von Schrotter, who proved the alternative worked. The Lundström brothers in Sweden, who showed you could manufacture matches without poisoning anyone. Matchgirls in London, who walked out of the factory and refused to go back until conditions changed. Journalists and activists like Annie Besant, who published what was happening behind those factory walls. William Booth, the Salvation Army founder, who opened a competing factory to prove that safe production was not just possible but commercially viable. And an American president who personally pressured a corporation to surrender a patent so the rest of the industry could finally stop poisoning its workers. Every one of those steps was resisted. Every one of them was called too expensive, too disruptive, too risky for the market. And every one of them happened anyway, because eventually the cost of doing nothing became impossible to defend. White phosphorus is still manufactured today. It is still loaded into military munitions, still used in certain industrial processes. The glow that amazed Hennig Brand in that Hamburg cellar still burns. The element has not changed. What changed is what we decided to do with it, and who we were willing to let pay the cost. If you found this story worth your time, hit subscribe and leave a like so more people can find it. And if there is an element or invention you think deserves its own deep dive, put it in the comments.